Good morning, and thank you for joining us at the third Carbon Pricing Hub event. We are coming to you live from the beautiful Maastricht University campus here in Brussels, and we have some very interesting guests for you today. My name is Jorien Wallast, and I will be your host. I'm a journalist, but I have also worked in the environmental movement for more than a decade on climate and energy. So I'm very excited to be here today and participate in this very important discussion on the revision of the ETS. So what the Carbon Pricing Hub aims to do is to create a space for everyone who is willing to participate and be involved in the European Emission Trade Scheme, or in short, the ETS. This collaboration is a consortium of 10 European NGOs who harness people power to reduce emissions, for example, by doing research and advocacy, but also by organizing public events like these. It's a program funded by the European Union LIFE program and by the European Climate Foundation. And after this event, more will follow. So I hope you enjoy today and will join us again in the future. Our topic for today is, of course, the ongoing negotiations on the revision of the ETS for the period until 2030, which are coming to a close in the next couple of weeks. And the dialogue that we will set up between the EU policymakers and civil society organizations will take stock of the progress made so far. We will discuss remaining priorities to improve the EU ETS and make it fit for purpose. Well, at this very moment, trilogue negotiations are happening between the Commission, the EU Parliament, and the European Council. What is the status of these negotiations? What has already been decided? Are there any loose ends to be tied up? And what does civil society expect from the process? Can policymakers live up to the challenge? We will find out today, as NGO representatives from all over Europe will express what is still on their Christmas wish list for a new and improved EU ETS. They will discuss their hopes and their concerns with our panelists, who are policymakers from European Parliament and the European Council. And of course, we will take questions from our online audience as well. I would really like you to actively participate in the discussion, and you can do that by using your chat function. I hope you can see that in your screen. At any time, you can pose a question to our web team. They can take those in the Q&A section, which is also on your screen. And they can put it on the screen here in the studio, so I can try to add that to the conversation. From our previous events, we know that our audience has very diverse backgrounds and that the expertise on ETS varies. Just to get to know you a little bit and kick off the event, we would like to do a small polling. It's popping up on your screen right now, if I'm correct. It is just 5 questions. So here we go. Let me see. Oh, it's so small on my screen that I can't really read the questions. Let me see. Well, the first question, which I can't read, but you can check a box for the answer that you will need. And just a remark, if at any question you check the box other, we kindly request you to put in the chat what you meant by other, so we can do something with those results later. Can we go to the next polling question? If everybody has already given his answer. Let's see. I see you can answer all the questions in your own pace. So that is good news. I would say go for it. And as soon as everybody has been answering, then we can see the results here on the screen. And probably you can see them on your computer as well, but I would have to check. Let's give you just another short minute, and then we can see who you are. All right. I'm looking at our web team right now. Did you receive all the answers? Okay. Well, thank you for participating. I am just checking to see if I can see the answers. I see there's a lot of people from the NGOs, but also industry. And policymakers as well. So basically, it's a pretty mixed audience, like our previous events. That is good news. While we wait for the next results, I just want to say that when we move on to the discussions, our guests are all experts, but just in case you aren't, I will try to prevent the discussion from going too far into the super expert domain. I'm not an expert either, so I'm going to ask all the naive questions that I have to our experts. And if you are losing track of the conversation or you have a clarifying question, do not hesitate to put it into the Q&A so we can act on it. Let me see. We have a lot of knowledge and expert in our audience, it says in the poll. The question, do you think negotiations will come to an agreement? It's a split audience. 54% says yes, they are optimistic, and 44% says no. So there's a lot of work to do there, I think, for the EU bodies to get to a good agreement. Then when it comes to what topic you think is a priority, implementing the ETS2, which is about building and road transport, 32%, speeding up, phasing out all free allowances, 42%, so that's kind of a priority for our audience. Very understandable. And let me see, what else do we have? The question if you are optimistic. That's a very exciting question. No, 39% says no to being optimistic. Well, hopefully after this conversation, maybe that percentage will change. Positive is also 32%, so it's kind of a split audience as well. Probably like a third of you are still deciding what side you're on. That's good news. Let me see. Let's move on to the discussions, because that's what we're all here for. As you can see, if we zoom out a little bit, I am not alone in the studio right now. I will introduce all the speakers, but first, let me take you through the program of the next 1.5 hours. We have representatives from 4 different civil society organizations who will be joining us here in the studio and online. And they will take turns in introducing their wish list for the ETS negotiations. And we will discuss this accordingly with 2 panelists from the European Council and from European Parliament. Topics will involve carbon leakage and CBAM, ETS revenues, the Modernization Fund, the Social Climate Fund, and much more. So lots of interesting things for you to hear about and participate in. And after we have discussed all topics with our guests and with you, our audience, we will wrap up around 12. A video registration of this whole conversation will be available online soon, so if you are interested, you can watch again. Well, before we start with the first Christmas wish list, let's introduce our studio guests. To my right, if we can zoom out, yes, hi, Romain Logier. He is from WWF, and you have published recently a rather explosive report on ETS revenue expenditure that we will discuss later today. We also have a guest arriving a little bit later. That's Mr. Peter Liese. He's the official rapporteur on ETS for European Parliament. He's on his way here, and he will be joining us in a short while. Roman, if at any time you feel like stepping into the discussion or adding something, if you have a remark or a question, just feel free to do so. We want to make the discussion as lively as possible. And of course, and of course the same thing applies to our online speakers. We hope that we can exchange, a lot of interesting ideas, but also opinions and wishes for what is next to come. But first, let's go to our first panelist. Joining us online is Eva Plotchek-Kuesova. I really hope that I'm pronouncing this correctly. You are a climate and environmental attaché and part of the permanent representation of the Czech Republic in Brussels. Can you see us? I cannot see you. Probably the audience online can hear you well. We're fixing the audience or the audio here in the studio because you're a little bit hard to understand right now. But I'm going to welcome you to be a part of our discussion today. Here in Brussels, the holiday season has already begun. There's Christmas decorations everywhere. But I doubt you have any time to put up your own Christmas decorations, given that the trilogue negotiations should be wrapped up before the end of this month. My first question to you would be, how are you doing?
Well, thank you. I'm doing fine. The exciting times, this is what we have signed up for when we joined the presidency. Oh, on the video, actually, there now doesn't help me. I can start my video because the host has stopped it. So maybe if from the interviewer team can unstop it, then people will be able to see me. But thanks for asking, and I'm doing fine. I'm doing
Yes, I think they are working on that right now to make sure that everybody can see you. I'm just going to ask you some questions in the meantime. You are a climate and environment attaché. For the people in our audience that do not know exactly what your role is here in Brussels, could you briefly explain that to us?
Yes, so I'm the representative of the presidency of the EU Council at the moment. So I mean, the European Council that is what I do at the moment is I have the chair of the working party for the environment and climate issues, and I lead the negotiations for the member states of the Fit for 55 package, mainly on EU ETS negotiations, and I am supporting also the procurement regulation and for the income with our EU and so the main topic of my days and nights.
Yes. And from your perspective, can you give us some insight in what is happening in the negotiations right now?
Well, the negotiations deal with the division of the package for the year and a half now on hold and for the parliament. Well, we did negotiations with Parliament in July, and there is the political pressure, of course, from one side, and from the interpretation, but I think also from civil society and other players, including the industry, also these negotiations as soon as possible. So that's what we are aiming at. We will try in the next 2 weeks to see where there is room for agreement between the Parliament and the member states. That's the Czech Republic.
Yes. And how do you view the situation? Are you confident you will get to an agreement in the next couple of weeks?
You know, I think the policies and the answers were quite accurate. It is really, it explained, you know, there is definitely political will. We are working hard and I know the rapporteur is not there yet, so I can give him some credit as well. You know, he and his team are working very hard on this as well. At the same time, everybody is aware that this is a very big piece of legislation and it's new cars coming in into emission trading, and there are lots of amendments that need to be doing. So there is political will, so there is hope. At the same time, the number of oppositions that they're facing at the moment it's really big. So the next 2 weeks will be, I think, really, really intense. And I think we will see, you know, that we have the trial planned for 16th of December. So, of course, we will try. And it will depend on the flexibility that both of the institutions, as well as the European Commission, can bring to the table.
Yes. I just have a question from our web team. If you can try switching on your camera now.
Hello. I hope you see me now.
Hi. That is better. Yes. Oh well, that's good news. It's easier for us to have a conversation if we can see you as well. So welcome again. I have one more question for you. If you would have to pick like the most difficult subject in the trilogue negotiations right now, what would it be? Which part of the package?
Thank you. Well, it's difficult to choose. You know, we have, as I mentioned, in the proposal that we have so many open issues and I think the reason why we have so many open issues is a lot of these issues are interlinked and interconnected. This is a market-based mechanism we talk about, and the measures that we take, we should not take them lightly, and they have to work together. So, in a sense, you know, what could have been done separately, for example, on the technical level, because there are technical adjustments, or you know, the clusters can stand by themselves. That will have some good progress made. You know, we had a good progress on market functioning, on Article 29A, there's price fluctuations, and on the functioning of the market and the players who have access to the market. Also, at the last trial, my colleague Alish had successfully agreed on the maritime cluster. So, what would have been separated, what is left are things that are interconnected and that you cannot really deal with separately because they influence one another. So from the open issues, of course, the free allocation and scope is a big one. We're setting up new rules for how the free allocation should be awarded to installations. We're looking at the scope, you know, what should be in, what should be out, what should join at what time, and of course how the Commission should analyze the impact of this. That's very, very important, of course, for the management and the funds that are set up under the ETS, which is the Innovation Fund, and the Modernization Fund for Modernized Legislation, but also the question of revenues, what revenues, and also the discussion what we call in the Council ERP, so they have process for the requirement of CDS2. So adding one clause in the whole transport and trying to get the instrument of the social climate fund which serves as the protection for the water. So
yeah.
These are the biggest open issues that we will have to tackle that the trial on the 15th. So lots of them are interconnected and the decision can be made on them as a package, so we're making sure that the decisions we're making, we're taking with knowledge and responsibility, that we're interfering in the market, in the carbon market, that it's not just providing tools to reach our climate ambition, but also it's providing a lot of money, to be honest. So I would say that the EU to deal with this transition and provide services
Yes. Yes, yes. As you can see, our next panelist has arrived. Mr. Peter Liese, Official Rapporteur for the European Parliament on ETS. Welcome to our discussion here today. We will get back to you soon. I just have one follow-up question for you, and that's about BRT, ETS BRT. You basically mentioned all of the topics that we are going to cover today, when you were saying that, well, what your most pressing issues are. I have one question about ETS2, which would add building and road transport sectors to the ETS in a separate system. Some MEPs stated that if ETS2 is not adopted by the end of the year, that could tank the whole Fit for 55 package. And my question, my final question before we move on to our next panelist would be to you. How do you view this situation? Are you confident that you are able to resolve issues when it comes to ETS2 or ETS BRT, as you call it?
Thank you. Let me make a great question, and you know, it's a tough one to answer. As I mentioned, you know, we work very hard with the same for the and the scheme to see what the compromises could be on all issues, including the PRT, where we had fundamental differences in the positions between the Parliament and also the same with the social plan fund. Obviously, I think the point that you alluded to is based on the fact that the BRT is an integral part of the way the Commission made their proposal. BRT or ETS is an integral part of the legislative proposal. So there is no way that you can have agreement on ETS if you don't have agreement on the BRT and also on the social plan fund. So in that sense, if we don't find a common ground on the ETS, it is a real threat that we cannot have any agreement on the ETS by the end of the year. But also, it's not the end of the world. You know, the fact that we will not really agree to it doesn't mean this is the end of the world and in favor of the Fit for 55 package. We have already closed important files of the package. You know, there are other files in the energy and eco-fuel council that we are still working on. And as I mentioned, with Commissioner Liese, I think there is political will, and where there is political will, there is hope to have an agreement. And so I think it's still possible, but at the same time, you are right. If we don't have agreement on the PRT and social climate fund, there will be no agreement on the ETS as a whole.
So there's a lot of work to be done there. Thank you so much for that introduction. We will get back to you later in the discussions. Joining us now is Mr. Peter Liese, as I said. Thank you for being with us today. I hope you, for your part, can give us an update on the status of the trilogue negotiations from Parliament. How do you feel about the progress made so far?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and also thank you for the cooperation to EVA. You know, we are struggling with the mandate that member states gave to the Czech presidency, but definitely EVA is doing a great job to move forward and try to elaborate compromises, and so am I doing at the Parliament side. So the problem is not EVA. I hope the problem is not me, but we have also people that give us a mandate or don't give us a mandate. And it's of course it's logical that we have a lot of tension and a lot of discussion, because it is the biggest file ever that we have treated in the European Parliament when it comes to climate and environmental policy. To just give you one figure, the effect of CO2 cars, and the world has discussed CO2 cars, and we will vote next week in Strasbourg. The CO2 cars legislation, as it stands now, will save until 2030, and that's the Fit for 55 is all about, until 2030. It will save 60 million tons of CO2. The ETS, if we take a middle ground between the Council and the Parliament, will save 1,500 million tons of CO2. It's much, much bigger. It affects much more people, not only the car industry, but all industry, almost everybody in Europe. So it's clear that we have a lot of discussions, and we have still a long way to go before the final trialogue next Friday and Saturday. But I think compromises are possible. But I really have to challenge the Council and somehow also the Commission, not Eva, because we see an attitude of the Council that we just cannot accept. And you know, these negotiations are complicated. We have already spent evenings to agree on maritime. We have phone calls on Sundays. It's a lot of work and a lot of tension, and to make it somehow possible to survive in the European Parliament's delegations, we started to make a playlist to have some fun. And yesterday, my shadow, Emma Wiesner, she's from Sweden, and she gave some contribution to the playlist from ABBA. She said, first of all, it's money, money, money. So that is the big problem what we have with the Council, 1,500 million allowances. And there is somehow the assumption, mainly by the national finance ministers, it's all ours. It's member states' money, so Eva, not take it personal, but Emma Wiesner said, the Council's attitude is gimme, gimme, gimme. And also, the Council's attitude is dire straits, money for nothing. So, no commitment in legal form where the money should be spent for. For example, on the Social Climate Fund, the Commission made a proposal with very clear points how the money should be spent and a co-financing of member states, so that 50% of the money that comes from the ETS2 or ETS BR3 is spent for a clear purpose. And I cannot blame the Czech presidency, but I can blame my government in Germany. In the current energy crisis, they pay the gas bill of millionaires. They gave a tank rabat for gasoline and diesel, also for those having big cars and have a lot of money. It should be more targeted. And that's why we don't want money for nothing. We want money to be spent on purpose. And one challenge that we have, and it's getting more and more important in these days, is the Innovation Fund. We have told industry, you need to decarbonize. You need to get rid of the free allowances. You need to go for carbon-free steel, chemicals, and so on. Yeah. And we said, we take away the free allowances, and you will get the Innovation Fund. But now, in the Council's mandate, the Council empties the Innovation Fund twice. In the ETS mandate, it's much less than the Commission has suggested and than we want. And then they take it the second time for financing Repower. And I'm really angry with the finance ministers. I got a call from a German government representative yesterday, and he said, oh, if we go for the Parliament's position, Germany will pay more than we get. And I challenged this German representative, isn't it about Europe here? Repower is for getting rid of Russian gas. Shouldn't we have cross-border electricity lines shouldn't we have LNG terminals that supply not only one member state? How can you look at only the national envelope here? And shouldn't we have carbon-free steel for the European automotive industry and not only look at national financiers' pockets here? Yes. This has to be overcome, otherwise there will not be a deal.
So I can see you're really in the middle of negotiations. I can tell by the fire with which you are bringing across your points. What I gather from your story is that basically the question is, where did all the money go? Which happens to be the title of a report that WWF has just published about revenue expenditure of ETS funds in the last 9 years. Thank you for sharing your first thoughts about the negotiation process with us. Let me introduce to you Romain Loger. He is from the
Hello.
WWF. And he is also the first speaker that will share his ETS wish list for Christmas with us. Romain, can I give you the floor?
Yes, thank you very much. And hello, everyone. So I'm Romain Loger from WWF European Policy Office, and I'm coming here with a lot of data, but no fears, it's not too complicated. And I also, I'm in the slightly uncomfortable position that Mr. Liese has actually made all of my points. So this ETS debate is indeed about the money, and that's how we've titled our report, which came out last week, Where Did the Money Go? So here's a copy for Mr. Liese, and I would have liked to hand over a copy to Eva, but since she's joining online, I will just show some of the media attention in the Czech Republic that this paper has been receiving. So I think there's a lot of attention for EU citizens who want to know indeed where did the money go. So in this report you will find a lot of facts which I think are very helpful because it looks at the nine last years on what happened about the use of revenues, and that can inform what's coming up for the next decade. So I think there's a lot to be learned in the negotiations about those key amendments which can be made and which are going to make a difference on the use of revenue. So I brought with me a few slides. There's only 3 which I would encourage to look at. If we could show the first one. I guess my main message is that the ETS is often portrayed as something negative, right? It's a burden. We put a carbon price on industry and they have to pay. I would like to take the counter step to that and say the ETS is actually great, not only for climate, but also for member states' purse. It generates enormous amounts of revenues each year for all member states, and that's essentially what you can see on this slide. In total, in the last 9 years, we found that member states received 88.5 billion euros in revenues. Of course, a lot came from the recent years because this is connected to the ETS price. The higher the ETS price, the more revenue each EU countries receive. Germany is the first beneficiary country from the ETS. The second one is Poland, which I found particularly interesting because there's been calls recently for stopping the ETS and that carbon price. And I think one key message in response to that is that if it were to happen, then EU countries would be losing billions out of their national revenues because that's what the ETS provides. And in contrast, the burden for industries who actually have to pay for this ETS price has been relatively low. This is something that we find in our reports. Over the last 9 years, we have actually more than half of all the pollution covered by the ETS, which was actually exempted from the ETS price. This is what we call free allocation. And we found that free allocation was worth nearly 100 billion euros over the last 9 years. So we're putting a price on these exemptions from pollutions, and we found that industries who benefit from free allocation has actually received an amount equivalent in exemptions than what EU countries have been receiving out of their revenue. So it's quite huge. And one last thing about that is that over the last 9 years, the average ETS price that companies have been paying has been 14 euros. So today, the carbon price, I will not deny it, has been very high. It's around 80 euros. In the last decade, it has not been the case. Industries have had a price of around 14 euros, and that's not even counting the free allocation that we have. So in the next slide, you will see that ETS revenues in principle should be spent on climate action, and that is for EU countries. They consider the money is theirs, as Mr. Lise has pointed out. However, they've not been doing their homework very well. You can see on that slide a list of member states which have not respected the ETS directive recommendation to spend at least half of their revenue on climate action. So half the revenue is not actually that much. We're talking about a carbon price. The revenue collected should, in theory, go back to climate action if we were to have an ETS that functions at its best, meaning it puts a price on emissions so that industries get incentivized to reduce their emissions. But this is not only a stick, right? Industries should also get some of that money back in terms of investments for climate action. But a lot of EU countries, including Czech Republic, actually have not redistributed all of their revenue on climate action. Although for Czech Republic, it was a close call, only 3 years and only near half of the revenue. Germany actually is doing very well on that. It's spending nearly all their revenue on climate action. So if I had one wish list for Christmas, that would be the first one, do spend all the revenues on climate action. I think this is an important social issue as well. In the context of very high carbon price, you're asking EU citizens to pay a little more for the energy bills, and then if EU member states do not use that money to help them get out of fossil fuel reliance, then I think there will be a lot of contestation. And then the second key message I have for policymakers is tighten what it means to spend the revenue on climate action, and that is, I think, my last slide. We've been looking at the details of how EU countries actually spend the revenue they say goes on climate action, and we've identified that a good chunk of it each year, especially in the recent years, has been spent on very questionable projects. And that, again, Mr. Lise has pointed out in Germany, some of that spending. So what we found in our report, for example, if we're talking about Germany, is that massive amounts of revenues, which Germany claims are being spent on climate action, actually finance industry compensation. So that means that you impose a carbon price to industries on the one hand, and then you use the revenue on the other hand it yields to reimburse industries for that carbon price. If you ask me, I think it's a bit schizophrenic, and it's indeed harming the effectiveness of the ETS, so it's something that needs to go in the ongoing negotiations, especially that it's called money invested for climate action. And another big examples of how some of the revenues which are claimed to be spent in climate action are actually not spent on good projects is fossil fuel subsidies. So we have a lot of EU member states which do recycle the ETS revenue on fossil fuel projects. For Germany, for example, in 2021, so last year, we had a massive subsidies for coal spent in the name of climate action of 381 million. Fossil fuel for subsidy for fossil or hybrid cars, 7.3 million, and of course the industry compensation thing. Czech Republic is doing a little better on that, but it still financed a green savings program, which was last year, or in the last 2 years, roughly 250 million euros, and it allowed for some of the gas modernization infrastructure. So there again, you're using your ETS revenue to lock in population into unreliable and expensive fossil fuel. So one of the things we're asking, and I think this is also something the Parliament is joining us on that, is to watch better how the revenues are being spent and impose a do no significant harm test to ensure that the revenues are being spent on genuine climate action and not on fossil fuels. So these are my two asks, which I'm hoping are well heard from the negotiators. This is a massive fight. Ensure that the revenues, all of the revenue, be spent on climate action entirely. This hasn't been the case in the last decade. If there's no improvement to the directive, it will continue with massive amounts because the ETS price is increasing, and watch better how the money is spent, even when it's claimed to be spent on climate action. At least ask that it's not spent on fossil fuels. I think it's not asking for the moon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Romain. When I recap, I hear that we, in most cases, don't know where the money goes, and if we do know where the money goes, it goes to coal. How is that happening? Can maybe either of our panelists respond to that and to the asks of Romain?
Yeah, I will try, and then I think Eva has to complement, because on some points we agree, and we made already big progress, so not underestimate that. And before I speak again about money, I would add another song to the playlist, and that's from Midnight Oil, Beds Are Burning. The lead singer of Midnight Oil was the environmental minister of Australia, and I think it's all about climate, it's all about saving the planet, and we need to, first of all, have ambition. But the second thing is also we need to design the ETS in a way that it helps to bring third countries along. And here also the right balance between ambition and competitiveness is also important. So that's why I support, and we have already agreed with the Council, that companies that are in international competition and suffer from the high electricity price, like aluminium, they get indirect cost compensation. And that's agreed with Parliament, Council and Commission, and that's a good thing, because we want to continue to produce aluminium in Europe, because if we deindustrialize, nobody will follow us. So that's a point where I agree with the Council, and we have already finished that part, that some carbon leakage protection is necessary. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we have a strong mandate phasing out any support for fossil fuels. And this is a strong point. Maybe in the past, it was good to spend money on coal and gas to make it more efficient. But we are in another world now. We are in the world of climate neutrality target, committed by everybody that Europe needs to go climate neutral. And we also have led the world here. Others are also going on that path. That's why the investment needs to be to climate neutrality and not less emissions, but no emissions. And I think that's important. Last but not least, and also here a good message, which we have already agreed in the last trialogue, visibility will improve. For now...
What do you mean by that?
Visibility means that we know where the money goes. We are relying on the study here, and you had a lot of effort to find out what member states are really doing. In future, every project that will be financed by the Modernization Fund, by the Innovation Fund, and hopefully also by the Social Climate Fund will have a European label. And also there is an obligation for the member states to improve the visibility for the national revenues, so that citizens will see where the money goes, and that will help all of us, parliamentarians, public, NGOs, to point on those that are not doing what they should. So there is already improvement during the negotiations and the outstanding questions. I'm also optimistic that we will solve them in a satisfactory way.
Thank you. Romain, just for you to respond, reporting from member states should be better. Does that tick one of the boxes on your Christmas list? Or?
I mean, it is important. I think transparency is important. I'm very happy and pleased with what I'm hearing. I think we're calling what member states report on ETS revenues, we call them reports, but when you actually look at those, and they are available online, we can have a look right now, it's Excel sheets, it's not reports, right? You have 5, 6, 7 tables, and people can just scroll around them and look at numbers, and the description of projects very often are just one line, such as investments in renewable energy, which doesn't really tell us, where the money is going at the national level. Is it financing bioenergy? If so, is it financing sustainably sourced bioenergy, for example? There's really a world on climate spending of details which you should go into in order to assess whether a project is actually spent on the right things or not. So it is indeed an improvement. I would say, let's take another step. Let's make sure that all the revenue are spent on climate action, because the only thing that EU countries are required to report on when it comes to ETS revenue is how they have spent it on climate action. What they have not spent on climate action, we have absolutely no visibility at all where it's been going. So if you also commit to the 100% climate spending on ETS revenues, then it means you're also providing transparency and you go the last mile towards that.
Yes. So basically, this is a question for the Council as well, because the Member States are represented there. Mrs. Plotchek-Kubesova, can I get a reaction from you on that too? I mean, what we hear from Romain and also from Mr. Pieter-Liese is that Member States should not only be obligated to report, but also to report on much more than what they are doing right now. What is your reaction to that?
Thank you, and thanks to Romain and Pieter-Liese for their intervention. I think it's really important to know that no time they are achieving with some challenges that these colleagues have put up. It's true that under the current legislation, there is no obligation for member states. There is no legal obligation for member states. And I think that's what we said. And on that actually, there is a recommendation that member states spend 100% of the revenue. So whatever the member states are doing, they're in place of the legal framework. I think at the same time, when you look at the numbers and show some of the tables, I think it's a little unfortunate that in those tables you won't like those that are below the 50% mark. You didn't show actually those that are above the 50% and how much up they are. So I think you need to also show the other side of the story, because when we calculate the average, on average member states actually spend 75% of the revenue on the climate, even though they don't have this legal obligation, and they have recommendation to spend 50. But in your report, you only show those that are doing enough, that are below 50. But when you look at the average, the numbers are there. And when I started with this, the time they are changing, the Commission proposed to raise this 50% to 100, and we kept it in the council. The member state kept it. So under the current revision, if we are able to agree, this ratio will change to 100%. You still have some discussions with the Parliament and the Commission about the shall and should and the next table. This is a very political and sensitive issue. What I would recommend to everyone, around the table, go and speak to the finance ministry. This is the important thing. We have plans around the Europe that are doing the part, and we have ministries of the environment that are trying to do their job as well as they could, but there's always some minister of finance in each country who's responsible for this, and I think those are the people that we need to talk to. And when you look actually what the EU has been doing and what the member states have been doing with the revenues, I think the member states, if they're smart, they realize that we signed up for our climate targets, we signed up for climate neutrality by 2050 and like this. So whoever wants their industry to survive, they really invest in their carbon emission now, because in a couple of years it will be too late. So I think the member states, of course, they have some ideas, but they also have the responsibility. I think in many of these debates, we're talking about sensitive issues politically and ideologically, and we have very ambitious member states, climate ambitious member states, who are against this principle of EU telling them how they should spend their money because it's against their constitutional and budgetary sovereignty.
Yeah.
But at the same member state, they're spending 100% of the revenues on climate. So I think there also needs to be this aspect taken into account, that maybe, the governments also know what's happening in Spanish village and Romanian village and Swedish seaside better than maybe some MEP in the parliament or somebody at the commission. And I think that's a lot of the thinking that the governments have to be just very honest and blunt. But I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's getting better.
Well, that is sort of hopeful news. We will have to see what will happen in the next coming weeks. Apparently, you have some tough conversations to have with all kinds of ministers from member states. I'm just looking at the web team. Do we have time for an audience question, or should we move on to the next topic? We have time for one audience question, I hear. And that is, do countries get fines when not meeting the 50% or the 100% spending target? And if not, why not? Who would be, Mr. Liese, you want to...
I will try.
In short, please.
First of all, thank you very much to Eva for pointing at the finance ministers. The Council presidency, and especially the head of the working group on environment, is not guilty for that. It's the finance ministers. And that's getting more and more problematic. I was in Hamburg, just time for a very short story. I was in Hamburg talking to the German ship owners, German port people, and they said, we want money for innovation. We are ready to go to the ETS and pay our fines, but some money should come back to us. And I said, speak to Olaf Scholz. He's from Hamburg. He knows the harbor. He fights a lot for the harbor. And then they said, he's against. Why? Because he's a former finance minister. And that is the root of all evil. The finance ministers, they think money is only good money if it comes to their pockets. They don't have an idea of a European added value here. And that's really the problem.
Yeah, so then it should be a good idea to give them fines if they don't...
That's true, and that's in the Parliament's mandate. We want 100% to be spent on purpose, and we want a shall. So, a legal obligation. You can only get fines if you have a legal obligation. And Eva rightly said there is no legal obligation yet. There is a recommendation. And that is a key point discussed yesterday with my shadows. It will be one of the key points for the final negotiations to make it an obligation. And some member states are doing good, that's right. We can discuss about the details, but there are, of course, member states that don't even go to the 50%, and that must change.
Yes. Thank you. I think it is time for us to go to our next online speaker. And if I am correct, that should be Klaus Röhrig from Can Europe. Klaus, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Probably online people can hear you better than we can in the studio, but we'll fix that. Welcome to our conversation about the EU ETS. I'm very grateful that you could make it today. You have a Christmas wish for ETS reform. Go ahead.
Indeed. Good morning, and also thanks for the invitation. And also, very happy to be here, and also to see that Mr. Liese and Mrs. Kubuseva, you have time to exchange. My Christmas wish is a bit for us to zoom out a bit and actually, maybe take a bit into account also the song proposal that Mr. Liese was mentioning. The beds are burning. This is still the case. We should also not forget that one of the principal objectives of the ETS is to contribute to the overall EU's efforts to reduce emission reductions, and we're just a few weeks after COP27, where we had a couple of landmark victories when it comes to the loss and damage facility, for example. But overall, we still see that, in the words of Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, we're still on a highway to climate hell. So even looking into the overall of pledges that came from all over the world, including also the new pledge from the European Union to reduce emission reductions by 55% by 2030. And that also includes, of course, the 1,500 megaton reduction that Mr. Liese also was mentioning by the ETS. We are still not reaching the 1.5 target. So the 1.5 target of the Paris Agreement to limit temperature increase globally still remains on a lifeline, and it's really critical for action in the next years, and especially additional action from the big emitters around the world, including the European Union, to change that and to keep the 1.5 target still attainable. And here we are, of course, seeing some signals also coming from the EU to move maybe from 55 to 57% net emissions, also taking into account the recent other climate legislation conclusions. But this is still far from enough from a fair share that the EU actually has to contribute to the 1.5 target. It's a historical emitter. It has historic emissions that also need to be reflected in the efforts. So NGOs are calling for the EU overall to achieve at least 65% emission reductions by 2030, and then climate neutrality also much earlier than 2050. And I think it's also, we just see that the urgency for moving ahead there is also growing, especially also in light of the growing awareness due to the war and the fossil gas crisis, that we need much stronger climate policy frameworks in order to really wean ourselves off the dependency of fossil fuels in the next years. And here, of course, the ETS plays a crucial role. It's like one of the EU's critical climate policy instruments. It sets a target for 2030, but we see that the ambition that is being negotiated at the moment, also still between the co-legislators, it's really far from the potential that it could have had. We saw some very positive signals in the negotiations, first in the parliament running up to the plenary votes, but quite regrettably, like very strong impulses to really increase the ambition were lost. But nevertheless, we still, I think at the moment in trilogues, there are still a couple of critical elements that are still on the table that we can still strengthen to make sure that at least the kind of cumulative emissions that we will see until 2030 are minimized as much as possible. And there are still a couple of differences between the institutions. So, for example, our wish list also to increase the ambition of the ETS, we would say it's very fundamental to have a strong and early rebasing of the cap. So that means that we actually have the overall trajectory for emission reductions being reduced quite early on, also in line to bring them actually in line with the current level of verified emissions. This can immediately reduce also the amount of unused allowances in circulation, but also is a bit of a reality check for the cap and for the trajectory of emission reductions. And here the Commission and the Council actually have a stronger position. The Commission has proposed a rebasing of 117 million tons immediately at the moment of entering into force. The Parliament has this compromise of the splits, but therefore like a higher rate of reduction. But the splits in the end also really increases the cumulative emissions that will still be available until 2030. So we would really call for the negotiators to consider the one-off large and early rebasing of the cap. And then, of course, also to really tap into the potential of the ETS to also go beyond or push the EU beyond its net 55% target. So maybe combine it also with a higher linear reduction factor. And then maybe my second point for the wish list as well would be about the resilience of the scheme. So one element that is also still open and in the discussions of the trilogue negotiations relates to the so-called market stability reserve. So the instrument that is responsible for absorbing unused allowances or allowances in circulation, and then in terms of scarcity also would re-inject those into the market. At the moment, we're still in a situation where we have quite a considerable historic surplus in the ETS. And of course, if this surplus might survive until the end, until 2030, considerable surplus of extra allowances would also undermine the achievement of the ETS 2030 target. So there we look actually into some of the proposals that particularly the European Parliament's position has put forward, which is further strengthening the parameters of this market stability reserve. And one particular element here is the reduction or the progressive reduction of the thresholds that are triggering the intake rate. So this is a very technical element, but it would actually really lead to halving, kind of cutting the unused allowances by 2030 in half. So it would have a very considerable, very positive impact on really reducing the historic surplus of allowances in the ETS. So yeah, I'm very curious also to hear from the negotiators present how they see these elements about the ambition, both in terms of the rebasing, but also the linear reduction factor being tackled at the moment in trilogues, but also maybe particularly to to the Czech presidency, how open would the Council be to also consider the strengthening of the market stability reserve as proposed by the European Parliament? Thanks.
Thank you, Klaus, for your Christmas wish list. Let's first go to Mrs. Plocek-Kubesova. I'm still wondering if I'm pronouncing this right. What do you say to these demands? Because basically Klaus is asking for a stronger rebasing of the cap and for taking more of the surplus out of the market through the market stability reserve. Is that something that you can put on the table with the member states and that they will happily apply with?
Thanks, and you're doing fine on my last name, so it's okay, but you can call me Eva. I think that's much easier for everyone. No, thanks, Klaus, for that intervention and for these questions that you raised. And I think it's really important that you also mentioned at the beginning the global kind of perspective and the big polluters and how the EU can motivate and can be the example for the others. I think at the same time, also for people listening and the NGOs, I really think it's important that we talk to the third parties and we make sure that we support the civil society in those countries. You know, I was born in Czechoslovakia in early 80s, and we had the Velvet Revolution anniversary only a couple of weeks ago. And I remember the environmental movement was one of the movements that was at the beginning of the revolution, from the northern Bohemia, where the pollution was so bad that it really played a role. And if we allow these countries that are big polluters, that do not have democratic regimes, that have authoritarian regimes, if we support their civil society to be vocal on climate change and protection of environment in general, I think that this will make the difference in the long run. Because of course we can try, Mr. Lise and me, we can try and send them money or try to make a good example, but it needs to be the people on the ground that want the change. And I think for some of those countries, the people, the regular people, they would love the change, but they don't have the means and they don't have the power to do that. So I think it's really important that you made that point. On what we can do within the ETS in the EU, sometimes and it's the same, it's always when people don't know who should solve it, they move the problem to the Environment Working Party and they move the problem to the ETS. So if people couldn't save and solve CBAM and export issue, they moved it to ETS and they moved it to Working Party on environment, let's solve it. If EU didn't have money, let's use ETS as a cash cow. We're supposed to be answer to everything, but we should not forget there are other policy measures that also can help with emission reduction and that are helping a lot. When you look at the developments in the Energy Efficiency Directive, we're stepping up our ambition. The same with the renewables and the repower. We're stepping up our ambition, and those are huge emission savings that will come also in the sectors that are covered by the ETS. And I think it will make a big difference. And we should not forget that ETS cannot do it alone. It is a powerful tool, but also it's a market-based tool, and it's there also to provide the money so we can finance these measures. But there are other measures that we really should push for, and hopefully they can help. On the MSR, well, I'm a big fan of the MSR. When it was first introduced, I was here also negotiating it, and actually the fact that we are now canceling allowances that sit in the MSR was a Czech proposal, was a Czech compromise proposal during the negotiations when the first time we introduced that those allowances should be canceled at some point. And this is what the market needed as a signal. So, there are ways that we improve the legislation. The MSR was probably supposed to be there from the very start of the ETS, then we wouldn't get ourselves in the historic surplus that we have, but I think it's working really well right now. It proves to be working. It's taking allowances away from the market. We will be canceling those allowances above certain threshold very soon. So then, also the signal to the market will be there. Whether we can change the thresholds during the current revision, Mr. Liese will tell you the Parliament has ideas on that. At the same time, the Council was very, very careful and very specific about the fact that the reason why we were able to agree to prolong the stronger intake on the 24% to the MSR from the market until 2030 was that we don't change the way it works. We don't change the thresholds and we don't change the balance. There will be MSR review after proper assessment of the Commission coming up in 2026, and we should look forward how the MSR can help. And it will have to change. It will have to adjust. We will have the global stock take. 6 months after the global stock take, the Commission has to come up with the review of the European climate law. We will be setting up a new target for 2040. We will set up the new legislative architecture for post-2030. MSR will be part of that, and we have to adjust it to the new ambition, definitely.
Thank you. I am afraid that we are running behind the time quite considerably. So I'm going to ask all of our guests to be a little bit more short in your answers, which brings me to you, Mr. Liese. Can you give us just like a 3-sentence reaction to this, because the European Parliament does have higher ambitions than the Council on this part. Maybe we can stick to if you are as optimistic about the possibilities as your counterpart on the Council is.
In fact, Eva was not so optimistic because she was not allowed to elaborate on a landing zone on ambition. Ambition is key. I don't share the view of Klaus and many others in the NGO community that we are not delivering for the 1.5. If you compare the US target with the EU target, the Americans are not prepared to land at their target. We are overachieving our target. And in 2030, if we both achieve our target, per capita emissions in the US will still be 2.5 times higher. So there's a challenge, and in many other parts of the world. The problem is not Europe. The problem is how to motivate, convince, and push other parts of the world. We are doing what we should do, especially when we come to the, challenge me on that.
Well, the problem might not be Europe, but the problem is climate change, right? So it doesn't really matter where the reduction is happening and who is doing better than who.
Yeah,
but I get your point. I mean,
I'm responsible for my electorate also, and I was in Sharm el-Sheikh. No progress the 1.5 is only in the figure, but it's not any progress. Europe moved from 55 to 57. No other major move during Sharm el-Sheikh. So always to say Europe is falling short when we don't have a clear plan how to bring the others. So if we stop polluting today and the others continue like they do, we will not achieve the 1.5 degrees. So the key question is, and here I agree with Eva, how can we convince the rest of the world? And I'm working on that. On the ambition, we have a mandate.
One sentence.
It's not possible in one sentence. So then ask me more easy questions. We have a mandate to go almost to 64%, and that's important for the international dimension. We also have more ambition from 24 to 2030, and that's a key point in the negotiation. The double rebasing is, however, also necessary because we are talking about climate only, and that should never happen. Some people are talking about the energy crisis only, or only how can we get rid of gas from Russia, and don't look at the climate. You will shout at them, and you are right. But if we look at only climate and not the crisis that is happening in many households and many companies, we are not doing our job. That's why the double rebasing is for giving ease to those that are under pressure now, and at the same time increasing ambition until 2030 with a higher LRF and with a strengthening of the MSR. That is all important, and the mandate of the Parliament includes the three elements: giving breathing space now, but higher ambition in 2030 and a stronger MSR. Some other elements, no time to discuss about them, but that is the key message I want to give. Both is important.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for being so brief as you could be. I would like to introduce Stepan Vizi. He's from the Czech NGO Center for Transport and Energy, and you would like to raise the topic of ETS 2. Stepan, go ahead with your Christmas wish for the ETS.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you to Peter, Lisa, and to Eva Plocek-Kubešová for taking part. My wish is on free allowances and the polluter pays principle. So I think the polluter pays principle is something that should be at the heart of the EU ETS system. And as Roman already mentioned, like according to the WWF report, the majority of allowances was actually given away for free. And I think whatever already mentioned is key, that the ETS is an important source of funding. So in this, for the decarbonization. So in this sense, I would also recommend the ABBA song "Slipping Through My Fingers," because almost 100 billion euros was basically of potential revenues was lost over the 8 years. So for me, the wish that we have is really for the free allowances to be phased out as soon as possible. This is something that we don't really see an immediate phase out in any of the positions of the institutions. But when we look at the proposals, the Parliament proposed to move the date forward from 2035 to 2032, which I think is definitely an improvement. But on the other hand, it also postpones some of the reductions for later. So for the last few years, the majority of the reductions, and this is compared to the Commission proposal in the first few years, there will be actually less reduction of free allowances. So I think there is still a room for improvement, and I think this is something that we would definitely wish for the free allowances to be phased out as quickly as possible. In the meantime, what the Parliament also introduces in the position is conditions for installations that receive those free allowances, which I think is also key. So installations that would receive free allowances in the meantime, they would have to implement recommendations from the energy audits. We have to develop a decarbonization plan by 25. and then evaluate and report on the progress towards their decarbonization plans. So I think this is something that we would wish for, that in the negotiations it is also considered as a major resource to really speed up the energy transition and decarbonization, and that it's not seen just as a price on just a negative impact of the price. But I also wanted to, as you mention one more wish for the ETS2 and the Social Climate Fund, and I absolutely agree with the notion that the climate ambition and the energy transition has to be also socially just, and it has to take into account the social impacts. And this is where the Social Climate Fund comes in. And so we wish for a strong Social Climate Fund that should be launched as soon as possible, definitely before the ETS2 comes into force, because we can see what kind of impacts the energy crisis can have on population already now. And it is absolutely key that the fund is also large enough for it to be effective. Of course, it's not going to solve all the problems, but it's an important contribution. And this means that also the size of the fund should reflect the rising price of carbon that is to be expected in ETS2 over time. So, and the connected wish with that is that, of course, as was also already mentioned, is that all ETS2 revenues go towards climate action, because this is something that is very important, and it's important to have this legally binding part in the proposal. One more thing is also to exclude support of fossil fuels from the Social Climate Fund, because this would basically lead to lower income households possibly getting locked into dependence on fossil fuels for the future longer than other parts of society. And there should also be targeted support for lower income households from the Social Climate Fund. And one last point on the Social Climate Fund is that we can see a lot of room for improvement with other funds when it comes to public participation and transparency. So it is key to ensure that there is genuine public participation when it comes to the Social Climate Fund, together with civil society, with local authorities, because this also contributes to the transparency and contributes to the fact that the funds are then really spent on climate action, because this is something where there is a lot of room for improvement. Just one number, there is a requirement, or there's basically the Czech Republic reported that 20% of its EU funding went towards climate action in total, but we did our own independent analysis and we came basically to the number of 13%. So the actual number of funding spent on climate action is much lower than reported, which was also supported by the European Court of Auditors. So in order to really achieve the effective implementations, it's also important to have strong controlling mechanism, transparency and participation.
Thank you, Stefan. That's quite a wish list that you have for this Christmas. While we are pressed for time, I'm only going to ask both panelists for a short reaction to the Social Climate Fund, or actually for our viewers that are not acquainted with the Social Climate Fund yet, this fund is supposed to be financed with the revenue from ETS2 when it is implemented, and it's meant to provide support for the most vulnerable European households during the transition to a climate neutrality. There were a lot of valid points that Stefan made, but I would like you, Mr. Liese, to react to the one that you find most important.
Yeah, maybe two messages. One strong message to the NGOs, which makes me sometimes a bit confused and really angry. NGOs ask for more ambition in ETS1, and they think about industry. But ETS1 is also electricity. And many of the people that we are talking about when it comes to social issues are also hit by high electricity bills. So to go for more ambition, more than the European Parliament asks in ETS 1 will also hit consumers. And the problem is not existing only when ETS 2 comes in, it's existing today, and ETS 1 is existing today. And every price increase in ETS 1 will bring challenges for people with their electricity bill. That's why we also need the Social Climate Fund, and we need to be a bit careful in asking for always more ambition, cancellation, rebasing. This will hit average people like the ETS 2. On ETS 2, the good thing is that all the three institutions are in favor. It was a big debate in all the three institutions, but we are far away from each other when it comes to the details. And the detail is about almost everything. So it's not small things, it's big things. We are ready to move from the European Parliament side. We are, for the moment, of course, insisting on our mandate, but we are ready to negotiate. And the key point is what was mentioned. We need a bigger social climate fund, bigger than in the Council's mandate. And we need co-financing. The Council just deleted it, money for nothing. And we need a very significant amount of money from the Social Climate Fund coming to the people in need before the ETS 2 starts for the private. That is key for agreeing us to any deal. Pascal Canfin said, if the Council doesn't move, there is no deal, and I agree. But I'm also optimistic that the Council will move in the end. And Eva is working hard here. I'm working hard. But the key point is no money for nothing, but money for those in need, more money for those in need, less money for the national finance ministers, and money to arrive of those people in need before the ETS 2 starts.
Well, that's a clear point that you've made. Thank you for that. Eva, as I can call you now, we have in the introduction already shortly discussed ETS 2. So if you are okay with that, I'm going to move on to our last wish list, since it is already almost 12. So I would ask our audience if you have maybe 10 minutes more, so we can...
because I have another meeting at 12, so I will unfortunately have to leave in 3 minutes. But I wanted to thank you for the discussions and for the interesting questions, and of course to Mr. Liese. You know, we see each other almost every day, and we're, as he mentioned, you know, I want to appreciate the work that he's doing. He's not in a very easy position with some of his shadow reporters and the groups, but where there is will, there is hope. So I really believe together we can manage. So thanks.
Every day and every night, because the beds are burning.
Well, in that case, before we go to Nikos, because he still has a valid point that we can discuss amongst ourselves. Maybe, Romain, you can help me out with that. I would like to thank our panelists, Mr. Liese and Mrs. Kubicova, for being here today. I know you're very busy at the moment. I hope you will take something away from this conversation as well that can help you with the negotiations. And I wish you all the best with the busy weeks in front of you. And already a very Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Same to everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, then we are moving on to our last speaker. I'm sorry, I just have to go through my notes to get to Nikos. He will talk to us about the Modernization Fund. Nikos, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Yes. Nikos Manzaris from the Greek NGO The Green Tank. You have prepared a statement on the Modernization Fund. And before we start, for our viewers, the Modernization Fund was created to support 10 lower income member states, all in Eastern Europe at the moment, in their transition to climate neutrality by helping modernize their energy systems and improve energy efficiency. The fund is financed with ETS revenues and differentiates between priority and non-priority investments. And for you, Nikos, your Christmas wish list does not add investments to the list, but you want things to be taken off the list of possible investments for the Modernization Fund. Please enlighten us what that means.
The European Parliament suggests. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and also to our two panelists for their participation and contribution so far in this discussion. As you said, the Modernization Fund aims at supporting the financially weaker member states to essentially come to par with where the rest of the EU is heading in terms of the energy model. Now, it is becoming increasingly clear to everyone, I think, especially now with the crisis, that this destination is clean energy in combination with energy savings and energy storage, without fossil gas being a transition fuel. More specifically, we see that the REPowerEU plan essentially doubled the EU's previous fossil gas reduction target for 2030 compared to 2020 levels. And that really does not leave any room for new gas infrastructure. The good news is that there are already member states which are moving in the right direction on the ground, with a major increase in the contribution of renewables, which displace gas in the energy mix. However, there are also member states requesting new gas infrastructure to become eligible for funding through the Modernization Fund. In fact, this position was adopted by the Council. Now, should this become adopted, it would create two different speeds, so to speak, within the EU, with member states moving towards renewables on one hand, and member states stuck in a fossil fuel-based energy system on the other hand. This would in turn jeopardize the EU's ability to achieve its own 2030 climate targets. Therefore, my question is the following: shouldn't the EU ensure that its financially weaker member states in particular are aided the most in their transition towards renewables? Wouldn't it make sense to say that it's a major inconsistency in EU policy to ask member states to cut gas consumption on one hand in the next 8 years via the REPowerEU plan, and at the same time encourage them to use EU ETS funds to finance new gas infrastructure? Clearly, my wish list is to have a fossil fuel-free modernization fund in the next period of the ETS. The current, actually.
Yes, so, well, that's a very clear wish that you have. Just for me, as a layperson, I don't usually talk about the ETS as much as I do today. What is really interesting to me is that there is a modernization fund that should be able to help those countries that cannot finance the transition to renewable energy themselves. But in the end, it's mostly being used to finance more fossil fuels. How did that happen? I mean, as somebody that is not an expert, I just don't understand how that could even happen within the system. Where's the flaw?
Well, the current directive, first of all, the Modernization Fund was established in the previous ETS revision, ended up essentially in 2017. And it had two types of projects: priority projects, 70% of the fund, and 30% of that would be non-priority projects. Now, the non-priority part allowed for some fossil fuel-based projects, and the battle at that time was for member states to not finance retrofits of coal power plants. They were not allowed to do so at the time, but gas was eligible back then. We have evolved. We have 5 more years have passed. The climate situation has become worse. The need to actually move forward with climate action is increasing. Therefore, we cannot afford coal modernization, gas infrastructure. That is why we believe that in priority or non-priority projects, we should not have gas projects eligible for funding.
Yes. So then I turn to our other speakers of today, both online and with you, Roma. how do you think that this problem can be fixed in the next couple of weeks? Because as I understand it, all of the EU bodies are not in agreement with each other about this fund and how it should be modernized. Let me see, because I can't see the online speakers. Is there somebody, Klaus or Stefan, do you want to respond, or shall I give the floor to Romain first? Yes, Romain,
Yes.
because you know all about revenues and how they are supposed to be spent. So please tell us, what is your take on this?
Absolutely. I think as an intro, what we can say is that the Modernization Fund is going to be a lot of money for EU countries. Actually, we've calculated that with today's carbon price, EU countries benefiting from the Modernization Fund, so there's 10 or 12, depending on the negotiation line, they will receive about 60 billion euros worth of revenues. And that bag of money, as was plainly explained by Nikos, might partly be used to finance fossil fuel subsidies under current rules. Obviously, a good way to stop that from happening is to change the rules. Fortunately, there is an occasion to do that today, and that is the ETS directive revision. At the moment, it's the Council, so EU countries, which are blocking this from happening. And a key element which can help with the negotiations is the understanding that fossil gas is not or no longer a transitional energy source that can be used for the climate action. I think we've had a lot of facts coming up in the last 5-10 years showing that actually the way out of the climate crisis is not the switch from coal to gas, it is the jump from coal to renewable energy. And that is the only way that is going to allow us to actually keep our promise and hold temperature level below 2 degrees towards 1.5, 1.5 being obviously the best solution to do that. And the war in Ukraine is proving right, actually, to that statement. Fossil fuels are not a reliable energy. And this personally frustrates me a lot when you see countries like Poland and Central Eastern European countries, which are adamant that we need to phase out fossil fuels and get rid of our dependence, especially on the Russian fuel. On the other hand, they keep fighting for these sorts of exemptions in the fund. So this needs to stop. And if I had one joker as well to ask if we are to actually improve how the money is being spent, not only in the ETS, also in the Modernization Fund and also by all EU countries, is to give in to that specific amendment in the Modernization Fund that requires that in exchange for the 60 billion euros beneficiary countries to the fund actually commit to a climate neutrality target at the national level. And this is something that Eva mentioned before she left. She said EU countries are committed to achieving climate neutrality, but for now it hasn't been translated into laws. So EU countries, half of them have a national climate neutrality target, the other half don't, and they probably expect that those countries who committed are going to balance out and reduce emissions faster, but that shouldn't be the case. So one way to ensure that the money would be spent properly is to ask all EU countries to achieve climate neutrality before 2050 and to write that into the legislation.
So basically what you're saying is everybody's in agreement that we have to move forward and we have to move faster, and nobody's happy with gas, but nobody's obliged to do anything about it either. Then it comes back to it all being words on paper.
Absolutely.
Yes. So Nikos, about the jump from coal to renewables, in your country, in Greece, that actually happened, right? Can you tell us something about how that played out for your country? Was it as difficult as everybody says that it is?
No, actually, no, it is happening. It hasn't happened yet, but it is happening. We observe it with official data. What's going on in 2022, in the middle of the energy crisis, is the following. We have a drastic cut in fossil gas consumption. We have reduced by 18% gas consumption in the first 10 months of 2022. At the same time, we have not increased lignite, as many people thought that it would happen. And we have also reduced our dependence on imported electricity. We have cut that by 20%. And this miracle, quote unquote, happened through the a rapid deployment of renewables. We have installed 20% of our renewable capacity just within these 10 months. It's really a very good example to show that the transition from coal to clean is possible, and it's not possible despite of the crisis, but it is possible because of the crisis.
Yes, because now everybody realizes that gas is not the answer to our problems.
And renewables are cheap.
Yes. I'm afraid I will have to wrap up the conversation for today. We have run a little bit late. I hope that's not a problem for all of our viewers. It has been noon, so many people will probably feel ready for a well-deserved lunch break. And I would like to thank all of our guests today, our speakers from all the different NGOs here in the studio and online for your participation in this third carbon pricing hub from today. I think it was an insightful discussion on many urgent topics, so thank you for enlightening us with that. I hope our panelists, who unfortunately had to leave like exactly at noon, that they can take away something from these discussions, and that in the next couple of weeks we will have something to celebrate for at Christmas. Having said that, of course, to you, our audience, a well-meant thank you for being with us today. I hope you enjoyed listening to the arguments made and by all of our guests, and I hope you will join us again at the next Carbon Pricing Hub in 2023. Like I said before in the introduction, a video registration will be made accessible online soon. And if you have any questions for us or for our guests today, just let us know and we will forward them to the right person. For now, thank you all. Have a great lunch, have a great day, and already have a very Merry Christmas.